All right. Welcome to the Productivity Show, a podcast where we believe you can get the important things done without sacrificing your health, family, and things that matter to you. This is Brooks from Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And I'm really happy to be joined by Marmel, our Scrum Master, our wearer of many hats. How's it going, Marmel?
I'm doing good. Glad to be back. Thank you for having me again, Brooks.
So I heard a rumor that you did one of your very first, if not your first, speaking engagements earlier today. How did that go?
Yes, I did. It was really nervous. It was virtual. I just found out it was actually a town hall, and I was one of the two guest speakers for their entire company. It's a real estate company. I think just here in the Philippines, but one of the biggest. So when I found out, I then became extra nervous. But it went really well. I introduced Scrum to the team, their teams, and talked about different technologies and tools that they can use with it. So I think because I love Scrum, I love using it, I love sharing about it. When I started speaking, it became easier. But yeah, I was very nervous, but it went really well.
Yep, that's usually how it goes. Well, congratulations. But this podcast episode is not about Scrum, it's about communication. And so maybe you found yourself, I think anyone who's worked in an organization has found themselves in a situation where you're just bombarded by internal communications. There's like emails, Slack or Teams messages, maybe WhatsApps, texts. There's like status updates from your different tools and who knows what else. And it makes it really, really hard to keep up and prioritize. Or maybe you've had a colleague call you or send you a DM in Slack or Teams and say, hey, did you read my email? And it turns out they sent the email like 5 minutes ago. Or maybe you found yourself responding to those Slack messages or emails from home because you wanted to show that you're responsive. You wanted to look present. And those are things that a lot of people have been in this situation. I know I certainly have in the past, but they're all signs that your team could use some well thought out communication guidelines. And even if people don't stick to them 100% of the time, having the guidelines in place and everybody knowing what to expect is a start and is definitely better than nothing. So, in this episode, we're going to share how you can build your communication guidelines, some of the things to think about, and we're going to actually provide a link to ours that has worked really, really well for us over the years after a lot of changes and iterations. So, here are three things you're going to get out of this episode. Number one, how to choose the right tool to communicate in the right situation. Number two, how to figure out response times so everybody knows what to expect. And number three, a simple way to like gently steer people to the right communication method when they maybe, how shall we say, forget about the guidelines. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about Windows productivity apps. So Windows users, you're going to like this, but hopefully we'll have some stuff for Mac people as well that they can find useful. And we like to always start every single episode with our top three resources. And so, Marmel, since you're on the podcast today, I'm going to give you the opportunity to share yours. So, what are your top three resources that you're loving or are making you more productive today?
Okay, so FYI, I have all three. So that's why I put it in, because for me, these are really useful and I've been, using it daily. So first is a keyboard tray. So there are a lot of keyboard trays even in Amazon. I've got like a $30 one here in the Philippines. So what is a keyboard tray? So these days, the tables that we have really don't have a tray just for the keyboard. So we share our land area with our monitor, with our keyboard, with our trackpad, and all those stuff. But for me, I really like an empty space in front of me where I can put my notebook and such. So with a keyboard tray, it's an add-on to your table, and it you can actually slide in your keyboard, so you have that extra space now. So there are a lot in the show notes. You will get links to that, and you can choose whatever is best for you. But it's awesome, and then you get more space on your desk. Next is is the automatic alcohol or sanitizer dispenser. We have this all over the house, and of course it happened. We started using this 2 years ago when the pandemic started. But you know what? I realized that even without the pandemic, we should be, careful, because like here in the Philippines, if before the pandemic, if I'm sick, like I have colds, already wore masks, and it was the same that we always had like a small sanitizer inside a bag, and now we have those automatic dispenser all over the house. And then next, and probably one of my recent purchases, and I love it because of where I am, where there are times that we just lose power, is a mini UPS battery backup. Um, so what I personally do is I connect this to my router. So even when the power cuts off, my internet does not. So for example, we're recording right now, and if the power cuts off, my internet stays because I got the mini UPS, but I still hope not because it's going to be very dark. So those are my top three resources. You have the keyboard tray, the automatic dispenser for your alcohol or sanitizer, and then the mini UPS battery backup.
Awesome. Awesome. So you can find links to everything that we shared in the show, those top three resources and everything else by going to the show notes at theproductivityshow.com/416. And yeah, the way your power has been going this week, it's very possible that we're going to be able to test that out. So we might get a live test of Marmel's system as we record this podcast. So stay tuned to see. All right. So let's talk about creating communication guidelines for your company or your group, whatever, whenever you're dealing with other people, could even maybe be for your family. I don't know. But whenever you're dealing with other people, it's helpful to put some frameworks around the way that you communicate, not because you want to be like bureaucratic or anything like that, but mainly so that everybody knows what to expect. Because whenever there's conflict, it's usually mismatched expectations. So we're going to go through three ways to do this. And number one is to define the tools that you're going to use to communicate. And this might sound strange. You might think that everybody knows what tools you use, but you'd be surprised. Like years ago, we went to create a business continuity plan. And one of the parts was to figure out how everyone would communicate. And so that involves, first of all, looking at the ways we currently communicate, but also what do we do if some of those methods are not available, because what you don't want is everybody scrambling to have to install something or figure something out. So it's best to have defined ways that everybody will communicate so that people know what they should and should use and what aren't appropriate for work communication. I know I've worked in companies where you would have like the official email system, but then half the staff was messaging each other on, well, this is going back a while, but like AIM or MSN Messenger or even like ICQ. And all that type of stuff just creates a mismatch of expectations. And so we want to avoid that. And part of this is for convenience. You don't want to have to think about how to communicate with people. But part of it is also for setting work boundaries. And maybe depending on the organization, part might be for privacy or data retention. You may not really be allowed to communicate through other channels. So you want to give some thought around that. So some examples, maybe you want to figure out what to do for email. So everybody probably has an email program that they use for work. However, a lot of times work email can start to bleed through into personal email systems. So you want to make sure to make clear what is and is not allowed to be communicated through work and personal email. That's number one. Number two is maybe voice notes. So back on, I think, the Productivity Show episode 226, our guest Erin Chase shared that she really loves using the tool Voxer for communicating with voice notes, sending it back and forth. And there's a lot of other similar tools, but she finds that that is a really easy way to communicate rather than sending a bunch of messages, just sending a quick voice message. Maybe you want to identify customer support systems, project management systems. What are you using for phone calls? Do we know everybody's cell phone number? What are you using for instant messaging? Are you using Slack, Teams, or using something else? What are people using for SMS or like WhatsApp and that type of thing? Are there situations where it is and is not okay to be using those type of tools? And maybe collaboration. So should meetings happen on Zoom, in Slack, in Teams? Have those sorts of things figured out so that everybody knows what to expect. So Marmela, if you're like figuring out the tools that you use, what are some questions that people might want to ask themselves when they're trying to sort all this out?
I guess if the first thing is going to be, are there any ways to simplify it? Make it easy, make it simple, not just for you, but everyone else is going to use it. And are there any systems or methods that we can eliminate? For example, if you think about it, is everything that you're putting in the chat really should go into chat, or should it go to your project management system? So are there more efficient ways to do things? Like hopefully we're not replying via email thread anymore, right? And then are there methods that people are using that they really shouldn't be using? Like me, I'm a stickler to like social media messaging is not for work. Like using Facebook Messenger, I see my sister do it and I cringe every time. Like, no. And then the next question should be like, are there methods that people are organically using that we should adopt? What do you think of those questions, Brooks?
Yeah, those are great. An example of that could be that, well, this was true when social media was becoming a thing. There was a tool called, this is again going back, but there was a tool called Yammer, which is kind of like a corporate version of Twitter that enterprises, Microsoft ended up buying them. But what started happening was the when Twitter and stuff like that was becoming popular, there were these subgroups of the company that I was working at that were starting to use stuff like Yammer and that sort of thing and building their networks that way. And so the company saw that this was happening. And so they decided, hey, maybe this is a tool that we should roll out more widely. And so when we talk about these tools that you use, it's not always about like clamping down on tools that people are using and forcing them to use something else. There could be situations where it's kind of like that. I don't know, it's probably apocryphal, but it's kind of like that story where when they were building a university campus or something like that, they didn't put in sidewalks until they saw like how people were walking, and then they built it. And or, you know, I know at the university I went to, there would be all these like nice sidewalks, but then there'd be a well-worn path through the middle of the grass that everybody actually use. And it's the same thing with communication tools. If you find that people are starting to use these tools organically, maybe that is an opportunity to like see if there's a use for them for real. And so that's the way I would look at it. Yeah, I think that the less tools you use, the better though. You know, we have all these tools that we listed, but like you said, you want to simplify, you want to make sure that there are not too many tools, because the more tools you have, the more complexity it adds when we go into these later stages.
Precisely. And you know, at first, especially when you're dealing with a lot of people there, you might get some pushback. And that's fine. They might say, "Hey, I don't have WhatsApp, or I don't know how to use Slack." You know, there's no better way than to start installing now and then teach them, how to use it. You know, and again, the most important is but again, it's important that the tools that we do choose to use are accessible, that you don't need an IT person to install it for you, right? So we've come a long way from it will show my age. We've come a long way from the MIRC days. And Brooks, I know you know this. And companies these days tend to make their product or application very easy to use.
Wow, I did not expect an MIRC reference in this episode. That's great. All right, great. So that's tip number one, is to figure out the tools that you use and the tools that you want to use. Let's move on to tip number two. But before we do that, I just want to give a shout out to our TPS Plus members. So TPS Plus is our kind of upgraded version of the productivity show. You get episodes a week early. You get episodes with no ads, which a lot of people like. And you get some other benefits, like you get the actual show notes where we use to record it. And if you're an annual member, you get a t-shirt, the really popular One Tweak a Week t-shirt. And I've had people tell me that they signed up just for the t-shirt itself. So check out theproductivityshow.plus if you're interested in learning more about TPS Plus. All right, so let's move on to tip number two. And that is, once you know the tools, then you want to determine what is the best communication method for the most common scenarios. And this is something that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how the more communications tools you have, the more complicated this gets. It used to be a lot easier. Like my first real job, if you wanted to talk to somebody in a different department, you would either give them a phone call, or literally you would write or type a memo, print it, put it in an inter-office mail envelope. The mail person would pick it up a few times a day and take it to the other department, and then the recipient would get it. And sometimes I would have to do fill in for the mail person, and it was an awesome job. You get to walk around, everybody loves you because you're always bringing them stuff. You get to chat with the secretaries and stuff like that. That was a great job, but that is a lot different now, because of course there's email, IM, Slack, ticketing systems, project management systems, comments, social media. It's kind of crazy. And so what you want to do is you want to think about what communication methods are better than others for the different situations. So give some thought to what scenarios are best for the communications you have from step number one, and kind of align those to some different scenarios. So for example, for routine updates and comments, like maybe it's just like an FYI, then it would be, say, a comment in your ticketing system or your project management system, your Asana or whatever, your content management system, just a comment with like a @ reply or something like that, just letting people know. Maybe it's a time sensitive question or a directive, then maybe an instant message like a Slack or Teams DM or mention would be better. If it's an emergency, maybe you want to actually pick up the phone and get a hold of the person right away instead of sitting there waiting and hoping that they'll reply to your message. Or maybe it's like working through ideas. It's a call with screen sharing or recording those videos and voice messages, something a little more with a little more context. Those might work really well. So what you want to do is match up the scenarios that you have in your team with the tools that you have available, so people will know eventually, once your guidelines are created, what to use for what. So Mamel, I know we have some questions that people should ask to kind of like flesh this stuff out. So maybe you could take us through those.
Yeah. So one of which is, do we have scenarios that none of our current tools are appropriate for? Next would be, do we have some scenarios where the wrong tool is overused? So those are two different questions. One is a tool that you're not using but you should, and the other one is a tool that you are currently using but shouldn't be. And then the other one is, are there some time sensitive tools we use after hours that don't need to be used in that way? Next is, are we sending emails that would be better to be calls or comments? I remember Tan with this, like, and he would actually go Slack me. I think we should just hop in Zoom and talk, because if we chat about it, it's going to take a long time. So you're saving time when you just, I was going to say pick up the phone, but no, hop in Zoom. And the next is, are we having meetings that would be better to be an email, wiki, or shared document? Like in agent efficiency, we use Google Docs, and we also use Confluence, which is part of the Atlassian software that we have.
Yeah. And so this gets back to what some examples we were talking about earlier. Like sometimes we'll send somebody an email when really it would be better to be a instant message, or it's the opposite, right? We send somebody a DM in Slack or Teams asking a question, but it's not a question we really need an answer to now. So maybe it would be more appropriate to have that as a comment for us, it would be Jira or Confluence. That's what we use, but insert whatever tool you use in your organization. Or maybe it's putting a message in Slack or Teams, but it's not urgent, so you don't necessarily need to mention the person. It's just kind of like throwing the comment out there. So it's matching those scenarios with the tool that is more appropriate. And yeah, what you said about having meetings that would be better at an email, wiki, or shared documents, that's so true. I think we've all been in those type of meetings where everybody's kind of like getting together and discussing something, and it's just like, why didn't you just make a Google Doc about this and send it to everybody? And then if they have questions, we can work through it, rather than everybody having to sit there and have someone present it to them, right? There's better mediums for all of these type of things, but a lot of times we don't really think about what the best medium for those is. So this is your opportunity to really do that matching up. So those are great questions.
Precisely. And because sometimes, even though, for example, for us, even like before, and I think I got called out for this, like, it's so easy to type in Slack or to DM someone, right? But if it needs to be part of an issue or the task that we're working on, that it should really be, like in our case, in Jira or our project management software. Because if it's in chat, it's very fast moving. You'd probably lose that information, and then you'd lose time trying to look for that information. So just like we say that everything has its place, it's the same for true for communication. And even at home in my family, we have our own communications guideline as well. We like, if it's an emergency, of course it's a call to the cell phone. So even if I have notifications off at certain points, I know that if it's an emergency, because I set my phone that way, if they call, if and they're part of my like my family contact group, and they call like 3 times within 5 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, then it's going to ring even if my notifications are turned off. So our, like, my family have our own communication guidelines as well.
Actually, I like what you said about how sometimes, you could be having a message in Slack or whatever, but it would be more appropriate to be in a project management system because things can get missed and it's a little too fast moving. Another reason for this, and this is actually something I didn't even think about until you mentioned it, a change that we made organizationally is we tried to get conversations out of direct messages and into our Jira, which is our system. And the reason for that is not so much something could be missed, but because a lot of times you could have two people having a conversation in direct messages, and it's about, say, an issue that we're working on. Like, let's say we're creating podcast show notes as an example. And maybe you and I are having a conversation about that, trying to figure something out. And it's something that like maybe Mary or Tan or whoever else would know. If that conversation is taking place in direct messages, no one else can contribute, no one else can help, and it's like this black hole of information. Whereas if the information is stored in our ticketing system, then everybody is on the same page and everybody has access to all the information. So picking these communication methods really helps avoiding communication silos as well. So that is definitely something you want to avoid organizationally. All right, so that is tip number 2, which is determine the best communication method for the most common scenario. Now let's put all of this together that we've been talking about, and let's actually build our communication guidelines. And that's tip number 3, to create your communication guidelines with expected response times. So before I started at Agent Efficiency, Tan told me that AE has 0 internal email. And I actually did not believe him. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure I'm sure you say that, but I'm sure there's some. But it turns out he's right. The only time there's ever internal email is maybe when we're forwarding something from someone external. And the reason for that is with our communication guidelines, there's almost always a better alternative. So now you want to take those tools that you use, the scenarios that you have to deal with, and put some times around it. So this is what we're going back to talking about with expectations. Whenever there's conflict, it's usually related to mismatched expectations. So if you expect a response in some sort of time frame, everybody should know about that based on the tools that you're using. And of course, it's not going to be a hard and fast rule, and nobody's going to be sitting there, with a stopwatch measuring response time and saying, "Hey, you used a tool that was supposed to be responded in 3 hours, and it's 3 hours and 5 minutes." No one's going to be doing that. It's just more a team agreement and getting aligned expectations, because when everybody's on the same page expectation wise, there's just less surprises, there's less conflicts, there's less dropped balls. Kind of like going back what you were saying about conversations taking place in DMs instead of in ticketing systems in Jira. There's a lot less dropped balls if that information is out there. And the flip side of this is that you don't feel like you have to respond to everything right away. This is a trap a lot of us get into, where we feel like we have to respond to emails right away. We have to respond to things in, say, a Teams channel or a Slack channel right away because it's there. But when you have these communication guidelines around it, then you know what you need to respond to and what you don't. So some examples might be if something's immediate, it's a phone call like we talked about. maybe if it's something you need answer within, just within a little bit of time, to say up to a few hours, then maybe a Slack or Teams direct message. Maybe it's a question you want to answer to, but you don't need the answer like now. Then maybe that is appropriate. Maybe within 24 hours, or within the workday, if it's not a distributed team, then maybe it's a Slack mention. So when you get a chance type things, or anything longer, if it's okay to have an answer like the next day within 24 hours, that type of thing. Maybe it's like a comment or an assignment in a ticketing system. Maybe it's sending an email, something like that. Now, in your organization, listening to this, you're probably going to have different guidelines. So that totally makes sense. And like I said earlier, it's probably not going to be adhered to 100% of the time. People are going to make mistakes. People are going to forget. That's okay. But having some sort of guidelines is better than a total free for all. Now, Marmel, I really wanted to talk to you about this because for those listening, you may or may not know Asian Efficiency is a totally remote team. We don't have an office, and everybody works in different locations. So I'm in Canada, Tan's in the United States. The rest of the team is in the Philippines. So we run up against these communication guidelines pretty hard because we kind of had to create them because of this distributed situation. So do you have any tips or experiences to share about working in a remote team and communications when you are on completely different time zones than other people? I mean, in some cases, the work schedules are a little aligned. Like I know you work closer to North America time than Philippines time, but still, there is some missing some time differences. So any tips for communication guidelines in a remote and distributed world?
First tip, because Mary logs in before me. She logs in quite early, and then I log in after her. And when we're talking, we come up with questions that we want to ask you or Tan in our huddle. So first tip is write it down. Because 2-3 hours from now, I'm going to forget that if I do not write it down. So it's a good thing in Slack there is actually a reminder. Like I can remind myself using Slack, or I can write it down. But one thing is, if if the person that you need to ask the question to or give important information is not yet there, make sure to write it down so that when they're online, you can ask that question. And I know I do this to you a lot, Brooks. And then in Slack, it would say, the person you're trying to contact, it's like 6 a.m. their time, but I know you're already awake. So when it's an emergency, I tag you because I know that I know that you are, you're already awake. And another thing, well, it's not really a tip, but one thing that I really appreciate in our team is that I noticed, the next day I would have a message either from you or Tan, and I would see that it was sent about 5 or 4 a.m. my time, and it would say something, and you don't have to reply right now. This can be done or answered when you log in tomorrow. So I really, really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's important to think about the people that you're communicating with, especially in a remote team. Like this happens a lot with us where we'll maybe, like you said, set a reminder to communicate later if that works better. Or if we don't need an immediate response, like I said, we'll use the ticketing system and assign the ticket to be responded later. So once you have these guidelines in place, then you can figure out how that works with everybody working at different times. Now, one thing we haven't really talked about is, you create these communication guidelines, you have your expected response times. Theoretically, everybody knows the deal. What do we do when somebody doesn't follow them? What do we do when somebody wants to ask a question and sends a Slack DM for something that really doesn't need to be answered later? Or maybe somebody sends an email that they're expecting an immediate response, but really that's not the appropriate medium. I've been thinking about this. I think one of the things you could do is, first of all, respond with grace and assume good intent. Don't assume that because somebody's messaging you something that isn't really urgent, don't assume that they're necessarily trying to get to you or being a jerk. Sometimes people just don't think about things or forget. So I would, assume positive intent, number one. Number two, the way I would personally handle it, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this, Marmel, is, maybe I would answer the question maybe if I get the message, with notifications turned off and stuff like that. Sometimes I might not even see it, but assuming I do see it, what I might do is like answer the question, but just like gently nudge them, say, hey, for next time, something like this might be more appropriate in Jira or something like that. Or if somebody sends an email and is expecting an immediate response, and this is especially true with like external people as well, what I might say is in the future, the best way to contact us is in this situation is through Slack instead of email works a little better. We've actually done this in the past with some contractors we've worked with. We've actually created Slack channels for them to communicate with us just to match the communication guidelines a little better. Do you have any tips or thoughts for what to do when somebody doesn't follow the communication guidelines?
I did this before. I forget who, but I know it was somebody external, and we had that person in Slack. So they asked a question via email, and I responded through Slack with a gentle reminder that, hey, I did see your email, but I would suggest that you use Slack for these kinds of questions because I'd be able to see it immediately. So very, very gently, just remind them, and it didn't happen again.
I like that. Be the change you want to see in the world. I like that. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for being here, Marmel. So our top 3 tips for creating a communication guidelines is number 1, define the tools that you'll use to communicate. Number 2, determine the best communication methods for the most common scenarios. And number 3, match those up. Create your communication guidelines with expected response times. So for action items for this, what I would recommend is identify the tools that you use to communicate and put some expected timeframes around them. It doesn't have to be like 100% right away. These are things that will build and grow. Like ours have iterated a lot over the years. Yours will too, I'm sure, but just start putting some timeframes around it. And what we'll do is we'll link to our communication guidelines in the show notes. So you can go to theproductivityshow.com/416 to get access to those. And for next episode, we'll be talking about Windows productivity apps. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. And thank you again, Marmel. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next Productive Monday.